Chapter 1. Who are the heroes? Eric Roth sat in his office alone, swallowing back a shot of amber liquid in celebration. The empty building was well appreciated after a long afternoon of activities that acknowledged the 10-year anniversary of the founding of the Valiant Federation, all summarized by a press conference by the end. He had sent the rest of the office workers home early on his way to the office, relishing the quiet room of solitude after spending the day in the public, answering questions with a perfect smile. On some days, Eric felt it was the only yesterday that he and his motley crew of friends decided to be heroes, to try and prove to the world that their strange abilities weren't threats, but blessings. "There is the man of the hour," a voice called from his now open door. The mask that he tried to put on after a long day instantly slipped as he caught the gaze of his old friend, Alexander Coulson. "Mr. Mayor," he greeted quietly, moving to pour him a drink as he sat across from Eric on the other side of his desk. He held his glass up in a silent cheer, tilting the rim until it collided with the other man's, then taking a long drink. Alexander mimicked his motions as they let the comforting silence wrap around them. The CRT TV that was placed in the corner of the room cycled through news clips from earlier in the day, covering most of the festivities in the Feotis district. He was hardly paying attention to it, just enjoying the white noise of the reporter until a single phrase made him perk up like a dog hearing a whistle. Who are the heroes? His hand paused halfway to the desk where he had moved to place his glass, suddenly aware of each sharp word coming out of the system. Earlier this afternoon, Mayor Coulson welcomed the leaders of the new Valiant Federation to City Hall to give a statement about their 10-year anniversary. Reaching a decade in age now, the Valiant Federation was founded by Eric Roth, Baylor Sowers, and Gail Anil, under the blessing of late Neil Coulson as a thanks for saving his son from his abduction. Alexander let out a quiet snort from where he sat across from him, shaking his head bitterly at the mention of his father. Eric shot him a sympathetic look, offering him the bottle of alcohol that they had been nursing together. The group of young men established the Federation after the organization of the same name, creating a space in the Feotis district to train and teach younger generations about the abilities they genetically inherit. Despite the original backlash that they faced, in the past 10 years, it is clear that their methods of teaching were effective, seeing a clear decrease in incidents revolving around young kids and their powers. Now that the public has gotten used to the idea of schools dedicated to the sole purpose of training abilities, Eric Roth and company have decided to shake the districts once more with their latest expansion to the Valiant Federation. A second later, Eric's own speech echoed through the TV, a recording of himself in front of City Hall from hours ago. "There's no question that the world's opinion on superpowers have changed since they were first discovered 40 years ago now. Everyone knows their pros and cons, the risk and reward that come with them, especially when it comes to their mystery. The Federation has shown everyone that when effort is put into training, when explanations are given where mystery once lied, those risks and dangers become more and more sparse. This organization was created on the idea of reclaiming control, built off of heroics on another level. That being said, I'm here to announce the next steps of the Valiant Federation wants to take regarding the Academy. In collaboration with first responders and our mayor, we are beginning our first initiative of superheroes, just like the ones we've all read about." "It's an even better speech the second time around," Alexander teased, nudging Eric's foot with his own to lighten the mood. Eric could only manage a half smile, sighing to himself as he got up from the chair to turn off the TV with a quiet click. His ears rang in the silence, eyes firmly locked on the wood-grain pattern beneath his feet. "The backlash is going to be catastrophic," he muttered under his breath, rubbing at his temples to fight against the headache threatening to come at him in full swing. Alexander let out a chuckle from where he still sat, nodding along with his friend's words. "It'll probably be worse than when we announced the Valiant Federation," he agreed. "I don't think it can get worse than that," Eric shot back grimly, pacing the floor like a wild animal as anger suddenly took control of his mind. He thought back to the day he stood among his friends on stage, similarly to how they had that afternoon. But back then, they were accompanied by another person. Eric, Baylor, and Gail hadn't known Nyla Ismat for long, Alexander knowing her for an even shorter amount of time, but she fit into their small group naturally. She had bent light in the palm of her hands like running her fingers through water, sending tiny fractals of stars across old basement ceilings like she'd done it a million times over. A silent strength for all of them, a teammate, a friend that they didn't know that they needed. The last time they announced a monumental project concerning those with abilities, she'd stood unwavering by their sides. And by the next morning, she was killed for the same idea. His friends were stronger now, molding to the harsh society as they grew up, but that still didn't stop the aching fear from spreading through his body at the thought of repeating history. It was Eric's idea to reform the Federation, and it was his idea to open the academy to teach others how to use their abilities. So if any more of them got hurt, it would be on him and him alone. I've been talking with the other instructors about what to expect, Alexander offered, taking another sip of his drink in forced casualty. They know what to watch for and how to protect themselves. It's hardly any different than how they've been living their lives until now. When Eric and the crew finished the construction of the Valiant Federation building, they knew that they couldn't run the operations alone. The call to arms came next, flyers being stapled to light poles, asking for those with abilities to apply to their organization to help teach the new generation how to control their powers. Of course, most of the public was still hesitant to out themselves with their abilities, being conditioned from birth to hide what made them special. A few applications came in, but not nearly the amount the group had originally hoped for. It was Baylor's idea to handpick the other instructors from those known around the district, who had already used their powers for good. After a few years of varying responses, of talking with those who had applied when the first flyers had been hung up, they finally created a team that would be able to shape the future of abilities forever. They divided them into what they dubbed as power tracks, based on what their teachers' abilities represented, grouping together students with like powers to make it easier. It had gone smoothly in Eric's opinion, which was his original hesitance in using the 10-year anniversary to once again shake up the world. Superheroes, he muttered to himself, shaking his head as he sank back into his chair. The wood creaked under his weight as he leaned forward, resting his face in the palm of his hand. Alexander huffed out an amused breath, loosening his tie and settled into his own, and sighed in a way that told Eric that he had more to say. There's something else we'll need to talk about before we make our official debut. Please, no more public speaking. Sorry, Mr. Roth, but that was part of the job description when you opened the Valiant Federation, Alexander sympathized, although he didn't sound nearly as pitying enough as Eric's liking. He could present himself as professional, like he had everything under his control at his organization, but under the surface his skin crawled every time he stood on that stage in front of City Hall. What am I missing? He asked heavily, meeting Alexander's eyes. I'm sure you've been keeping track of the recent activities around the districts involving abilities, he asked, only continuing when Eric nodded in affirmation. So I'm sure you've seen the concerns on this plasticine guy and the others. Plasticine, the name bestowed upon their mystery man by the local newspapers, was a problem. Blurry photos of a masked man who could manipulate material like putty had been causing trouble throughout the districts for a little while, each sighting causing more damage than the last. Eric didn't want to call the man a supervillain, the word sounding funny to himself, but he was on the road to earning that title from the media if he wasn't careful. He also wasn't the only person causing trouble throughout the districts with their abilities. The vampire, puppeteer, the Reaper's right hand, Manticore, and other cliché names reporters gave them, became bold in what they could do supernaturally. The original four had done their best to keep them on a leash, to prevent them from causing lasting damages not only to the physical city, but to their reputations as well. The public still hadn't quite learned how to separate the bad actions of one person with abilities from the rest of their population. After tiring patrols from the instructors, dividing and conquering the districts from Feodus to the Moors, they all agreed it felt like the right time to continue the idea of superheroes. Hopefully our announcement will give us a head start into our hero program, Eric commented with a sigh. The reviews have been mixed so far, but we also have to remember you haven't had the chance to show them what you guys can do, Alexander reminded him gently. He nodded along, crossing his arms over his chest and reclining as much as the chair would allow him. I knew that this was the end goal, but it just feels different. Different how? I don't know, he responded honestly. Maybe it's these other guys that you're talking about. It was stupid to even think that we wouldn't be challenged by another group. Well, you have a point, Alexander started heavily. They weren't the others I was referring to. Eric sat up so fast he almost spilled his drink from where it sat on the edge of the desk. Wordlessly, Alexander passed him a newspaper clipping, a bold title, a blurry photo, and a paragraph highlighted. Eric took a deep breath as he read the title aloud, the words feeling dangerous on his tongue. A new presence in the moors rivals the new Federation. Directly below the dark ink was a photo, a screenshot from a CCTV camera of a dark figure. It was not plasticine or any other troublemakers that was grouped in with his actions, but a masked character nonetheless. Instead of a black ski mask that had become a staple for plasticine, the newcomer wore what looked like a medical mask that covered the bottom half of their face, the rest of their identity cloaked by the hood of a black hoodie. There were no defining details visible, and it was only by stature could Eric assume that it was a female. "They're calling her the Saint," Alexander said, pointing to the highlighted passage from the paper. "Believe it or not, people only have good things to say about her." Eric only hummed in consideration, studying the picture further. She stood with a confidence that reminded him of himself, a persona built as carefully as a weapon as she stretched one hand out, palm flat towards something that was cropped out of the camera's line of sight. A robber, the article explains. "Do we know what her abilities are?" he found himself asking, eyes not wanting to look away from the picture. "No clue," Alexander responded immediately. "Apparently she's been pretty careful in revealing them, assuming she has abilities." "No one would be stupid enough to go and fight crime without them," Eric reasoned, with a scoff, only to be greeted with a shrug as the other continued to sip at his drink. "To be fair, I didn't think a bunch of teenagers would be stupid enough to try and find the mayor's kidnapped son, but here we are. You know, some days I wish we would have left you in that basement." Alexander threw his head back and laughed, and Eric couldn't help but smile as some of the tension slipped from his shoulders. He rolled the muscles out for good measure, placing the newspaper clipping onto his desk as he made a mental note to bring it up at the next group meeting. He knew that eventually he'd have to address whoever the Saint was to the public, but as the city's unrest about the previous announcement of superheroes still murmured through their streets, he reasoned that it would be wise to take a step at a time. "Have you put any thought into our debut roster of heroes?" Alexander asked after a moment, yawning as the day caught up to him. "Myself, Gale, Baylor, and Meredith, obviously," Eric listed. "But other than that, it's still a toss-up with the others." "We talk more about it with the others when they get back to Fiotis," Alexander reasoned, raising his glass in cheers to signify the end of what they've dubbed business talk. Eric had asked the others to go to the other districts for a week to prepare their announcement on the anniversary, and to boost overall morale to the Federation. He mimicked Alexander, raising his own glass in the air and gently hitting the edges with the other with a light noise. They both drained the remaining liquid, Alexander raising to his feet and making his way to the door. "Oh, before I forget," he said, halfway out the office as he jerked his body backwards. "I found an excellent engineer to help design the suits for patrol." "Thank you, I completely forgot to look at the references that Meredith gave me," Eric replied as his body deflated with the stress he didn't know he was still carrying. Alexander laughed, shaking his head. When they solidified a date for the announcement, they knew that the next step would be armored suits designed for their debut heroes. They'd be running headfirst into danger at all times, and they needed a symbol that would tell civilians that they were there to help, similar in the way that police wore badges and firefighters wore helmets. "I won't tell her you said that," Alexander shot back. "We'll talk more about it with the others when they get back." He gave another wave over his shoulder as the office door quietly clicked shut, leaving Eric in pure silence for the first time since that morning. His ears rang, and the only sound that he could hear was his own heartbeat slowing as he exhaled softly. "Superheroes," he muttered to himself in amusement, finally standing from his desk as he shook his head. He tucked the bottle of alcohol away, swinging his leather jacket over his shoulders as he flicked the light switch off and left the dark office for the night. Ernaline Adler enjoyed living in the silence of her apartment alone. She was by far not a social person, preferring to keep her head down in a crowd than draw attention to herself in any way. Her apartment in the moors was her castle of solitude, and she used it like a barrier against the outside world that seemed to scream at her for simply existing. Even if they didn't know it, she was one of the monsters that the news still liked to scream about, the ones that they accused of being dangerous individuals with unstable power. Maybe that's why she found herself intrigued by the replay from earlier that day, studying each word that left Eric Roth's mouth as he read his speech in front of City Hall. That being said, I'm here to announce the next steps the Valiant Federation wants to take regarding the Academy. In collaboration with first responders and our mayor, we are beginning the first initiative of superheroes, just like the ones we've all read about. Ernalite agreed with his words for the most part, agreeing with the fact that they had their abilities to help others, not harm them. Her hesitance stemmed from the words that he didn't say, and she could only hope that she was just borrowing trouble that wouldn't come. The Valiant Federation was built off the idea of helping young teens and children learn about their developing abilities in a safe environment with instructors to help them master control. Again, Ernaline firmly believed that it was the right step to introduce in the other districts, but she feared for the worst when they talked about the introduction of their superhero initiative, a place where those same young kids would be taught how to fight and defend using their powers. She knew logically it wouldn't be legal to force them into a life of superheroes and crime fighting, but even offering that as an option at such a young age made her skin crawl. Maybe it was just projection of her own past trying to taint a good thing, but Ernaline was a cynic at heart and wouldn't trust the new development at first until she was proven wrong. Her thoughts were interrupted as a stern-faced news reporter returned to the screen after showing Eric Roth's speech. There was barely concealed worry in the man's eyes as Ernaline couldn't help but sit up straight and at attention as he began to speak to the camera. We are getting a live report from the Desher district of an attack taking place in one of their shipping warehouses. Witnesses are saying. Ernaline stood up and turned off the TV. Not because she wasn't interested in what the man had to say. Quite the opposite. She finished her mug of coffee in one swallow as she haphazardly placed it in the sink as she made a beeline to her room. She instinctively reached to the top shelf of her closet, shrugging on her black hoodie like it was a bulletproof vest, and began to make her way out of the building and down the street that she had come to know well. She did her mental math in her head of all the fastest routes to there between Desher and the moors, securing one of her baby blue medical masks to her lower face. She took a deep breath as she let the new identity fall over her like armor. She was no longer Ernaline Adler, the girl who kept her head down in crowds. She was the saint, charging headfirst into danger because that's just what she did. It was a short walk between the districts, and Ernaline made sure to dodge where she knew security cameras were angled in front of storefronts. She became all too painfully aware that the media was catching wind of her nightly activities, and she received enough teasing from her fellow vigilantes, as the paper began to call them. No one would say that the recognition wasn't nice, that there were at least a small portion of people in the city that thought highly of their small group that would use their abilities to fight the bad. The only issue with their new clan of vigilantes was that it wasn't technically legal to take matters like that into their own hands, no matter how good the intentions were. She tugged her hood higher as she walked past a storefront with the lights still on, tilting her head down to make sure that no random civilian could see the details of her face that remained uncovered. When she rounded the corner to the street that she knew the shipping warehouse was on, thanks to being raised in the Desher district before moving to the moors, she was greeted with an eerie silence that made her skin crawl. There was no nightly chatter that never seemed to stop in the city that never slept. No sights of late-night walkers making their way home after long shifts, or any deafening cries by a villain tormenting their area. She cautiously took a step forward to one of the back doors of the building, opening it slowly as she let her eyes adjust to the dark interior. The stillness that surrounded the outside didn't match what she had walked in on. Within the walls of the building, it looked like a natural disaster had swept through. High shelves that were stacked with hundreds of boxes were tipped over and scattered across the concrete floor. Ernaline took a cautious step towards the mess, noting how the steel metal that had once held them was now bent out of shape, but not in the typical way. The support of the shelf was halfway melded against the floor, almost like it was gum left by the imprint of a shoe. She continued her cautious search, now keeping her eyes scanning for the man the news had dubbed Plasticine. It was the only pro to the new attention to those with abilities were getting. Nothing was a secret between Federation heroes, district vigilantes, and supervillains alike. Anyone who had looked in the newspaper in the past month knew that Plasticine could shape materials as easily as his namesake suggested. Ernaline kept her own abilities close to her chest, loving the jump it gave her in a fight against robbers and thieves, She knew that eventually someone would tell the media source and she'd lose her leg up that she had in a fight. She was startled out of her slow walk by the sound of a pained groan. Among the rubble of broken packing machines and cardboard boxes was a man who cradled an arm close to his chest. As she took another silent step closer, she noted the odd angle it was bent at, definitely falling in the classification of being broken, and it became her main focus. She cleared her throat as loud as she dared, feeling bad when the worker jolted in shock and in turn jostled his injury. He only stared at her with wide eyes for a moment, freezing when she silently knelt down beside him. Like the shock had worn off, he blinked harshly, leaning closer to her to speak in a whisper. "You're one of the street heroes the news keeps talking about," he said in a whisper, sounding so sure of himself. Despite her lips being covered, she couldn't help but smile and nod, holding out a hand towards his broken arm. "May I?" she asked in an equally quiet voice. When the man only gave her a pained nod, she laid her palm flat to where the bone pressed the skin from underneath, thankfully not puncturing through. She made a noise of sympathy as the man barely took back a shout of pain, trying to keep their location a secret from the villain that was undoubtedly still lurking around. For a long time, Erneline hated her abilities. It wasn't until she learned that they felt different to use on her own terms in comparison when she was forced to practice them on people less deserving. She took a steadying breath, focusing all of her attention on the splintered bone as she could feel the faint buzz of adrenaline in her fingertips. She didn't even need to push it to snap the bone back to its original place, as she focused her energy on mending the calcium, like the break never existed in the first place. "Thank you," the worker huffed out in equal parts pain and astonishment. She knew that it wasn't an easy process to sit through, and she gave his hand a consoling squeeze before she leaned in a little closer. "The villain here," she started quietly. "Where did they go?" "The basement. He was asking for our supervisor," the worker grunted, pointing with the arm that was never broken to a large door on the east side of the building. She nodded to him in thanks, rising to her feet as she directed him to the back door she had used to enter the warehouse to begin with. She watched him slink away for a moment, noting the slight limp in his walk. Torn ligaments weren't a part of the deal when it came to her abilities, so she watched him go until he turned out of her line of sight. She deemed him safe enough to continue her investigation. The door to the lower level was already broken into, the lock looking melted around the handle as Erneline pushed her way further below. She kept her footsteps light, straining her ears to listen to any movement to alert her of a fight brewing. When her foot hit the final step, she paused to take in the scene in front of her. The basement seemed too still, too untouched compared to the mess that the warehouse was upstairs. The silence stretched on, and the only noise that she could hear was her own heartbeat, slow and steady. She took a step forward, and another, eyes scanning the dark room for any other workers or plasticine. To her right, she could see a light coming through another room, so she cautiously entered, not seeing another soul yet. Instead, what she found was an office, a small room with only a desk and a few shelves lining the side walls. Before she could walk closer, a stray paper crinkled under her boot. Only one of many papers that were haphazardly tossed around the place. She knelt to pick it up, declaring it some sort of shipping order, and whoever had raided the office obviously deemed it as unimportant. She picked up a few more pages, finding nothing out of the ordinary. The only papers that drew her attention were the ones that were stacked on top of the desk, a list of employees and salaries. Her brows furrowed as she read the names, finding nothing that would lead her to a solution she was looking for. She turned on her heel to return to the main basement, ready to continue her search for answers. She slowly stalked between the intact shelves, eyes scanning until she spotted a middle-aged man propped up against one of the steel supports. She made a move to get closer, but stopped mid-step as another figure came into view, cloaked in shadow. He had a few inches on Erneline, that she could tell even from their distance, accompanied with a dark hood similar to her own and a ski mask. Like Sixth Sense, he stopped his approach on who she assumed was the supervisor and looked over to where she stood. He cocked his head as he stared back at her, eyes being the only facial feature visible, and he took a hesitant step forward. Erneline didn't waste another second, closing the distance between herself and Plasticine. She stopped her run until she was standing parallel to him, placing herself between the villain and the supervisor, as she planted one of her legs behind the bend of his knee. She could feel him tense the moment her hands touched him, and he braced himself into the fall, reaching out to drag Ernaline with him. The two of them rolled to the floor, but she was able to recover first, using the momentum to push herself up to one knee. Plasticine follows suit shortly after, kicking one of his legs violently and making contact with the center of her chest, sending her sprawling back to the concrete ground. He was able to reach and grab the front of her hoodie, dragging her into a standing position, still holding most of her weight as he stared back at her wordlessly. She knew that she could reach out and break whatever bone she could focus on, and that she probably should, but there was a mental shield that prevented her from even trying. She also knew that it had nothing to do with plasticine and a hidden power that he might have, and it had everything to do with Ernaline's upbringing. Instead, she brought one of her knees to collide with the man's gut, getting him to loosen his grip enough where she could push herself back. She didn't go too far, twisting her body with enough momentum to throw a punch that satisfactorily connected with his jaw. He stumbled back a few steps, shocked, and she used it to her advantage to get a few more hits before he could recover. She could feel her own knuckles split after each hit, each callus that she carefully built over the years now bleeding in a testament to her man-made strength. Plasticine managed to recover, grabbing one of her wrists harshly. In a last-ditch effort to rattle the villain, she reached out with her free hand, making a grab for the ski mask. She didn't make it far, the man twisting the arm in his grasp behind her back and pinning her to the ground. Her mind reeled for the next step, a way to get out of her predicament, or at the very least help the supervisor, who is still sitting on the ground, bleeding and watching. Plasticine pressed his knee into her back, pinning her under his weight as he reached out for one of the nearby shelves. He wrapped his gloved hand around one of the bars, and with minimal effort pulled on the beam, stretching it out of its place like it was made of putty. The support itself stayed solid, and he raised it high above his head, both hands wrapped around the makeshift weapon, and brought it down in a long arch. It never made contact with Ernaline, the villain being sent sprawling off of her with a ray of flames sparking from the darkness. She pushed herself up to her feet, panting in exertion as she followed the line of light. Standing in the dark basement, still dressed in the dark suit he had worn earlier in the day, sans a tie, was Eric Roth, eyes trained on where plasticine patted out the fire on his hoodie. The Federation leader wasted no time joining the fray, rushing over to where Ernaline stood to meet plasticine's next swing of steel. He dodged the hit with ease, both of his fists alight with fire once more as he swung another punch in his direction. Noting the distraction, she took advantage of it, rounding the villain and landing a solid kick to his lower back, sending him stumbling into Eric's hold. He again raised the steel shelving part, using his ability to quickly mold it into a fine point, but he didn't throw it at either opponent. Instead, the metal went hurtling through the air, and it was only when Ernaline turned on her heel to follow its path that she realized their combined mistake. The makeshift javelin pierced its way through the shoulder of the supervisor with a drawn-out shout from the man. The blood pooled around the metal, coating his already stained shirt to the point where she couldn't have been able to tell its original color through all of the red. Immediately, her focus slipped from the fight, making lightning speed to kneel next to the man with hesitant hands. She knew that her powers wouldn't do anything against the torn flesh in his shoulder, and that her first aid skills would only keep him alive for so long. Still, she focused her energy to fix the broken collarbone that was shattered in the impact. She risked a glance behind her at a particularly loud noise. The two men now stood across from each other, Eric half standing between where Ernaline was kneeling and where Plasticine stood. The villain, still panting in exertion, offered a sarcastic slow clap with his eyes still trained on Eric, shaking his head as he turned on his heel and made his way towards the stairs leading out of the basement. For a moment, she sat there, hands covered in blood as she desperately tried to slow it for the supervisor's sake, still believing that Eric was going to give chase to the villain. It would only highlight the differences between the media called heroes and those they called vigilantes. The Federation's leaders wanted a fight, and Ernaline wanted to save a life. "Help me," she commanded, watching as the man whipped around in shock, like he had forgotten all about her existence. She watched his face slacken, eyes flickering between her and the supervisor. He turned back to the stairwell for a moment, body twitching like it pained him not to run after the villain, but abandoned the idea. He made his way quickly over to the pair on the floor, wrapping his hands over Ernaline's to help stop the bleeding. Her body jolted at the touch, noting how his fingers felt freezing despite being engulfed in flames moments before. "Robert," the supervisor choked out, a trail of blood dribbling from the side of his mouth as he looked between the two. He wanted. Erneline shushed him when he let out a wet cough, looking around the limited space for anything they could use as a makeshift bandage. Robert? Who's Robert? Eric pressed, shuffling closer to try to understand the man better. The man shook his head as much as he could manage, eyes going glossy with unshed tears of fear. The blood continued to pool between the pair of fingers, Erneline trying not to cringe at the way it dripped down her forearm and into the fabric of her hoodie. She took a shaky breath, removing one of her hands from their tangle of limbs to hold the older man's hand. It's going to be okay, she lied steadily, watching the man nod along in agreement. The faith he had held in her felt like a weight, something that she'd never be able to shake as long as she lived. She felt the exact moment his body fell slack, eyes going unfocused and chest stilling with this final breath. She let out a harsh sigh as she relaxed onto the back of her heels, staring at the face of the man she hadn't known, but failed nonetheless. He was already too far gone, Eric reasoned solemnly. You tried your best. Erneline couldn't find it within herself to respond, shaking her head. She knew that Plasticine was most likely too far gone to chase, meaning that for the night he had won. An angry fire lit in her chest at the thought, scoffing quietly as she took in the storage space around them. Eric rose to his feet before her, almost studying her, as he offered a bloody hand in her direction. Wordlessly, she reached out and accepted the assistance to stand, gritting her teeth as she felt her muscles protest the movement. She gave a thankful squeeze before letting go, making her way to the stairs wordlessly. She made a promise to herself as she washed the blood off of her hands. She was going to find Plasticine, and she was going to make sure he could never hurt anyone ever again.